history. What is it? What does it do? Why is it black for 1 month out of the year? This question and more we hope to answer here at the Wallaby Mages Futon Education Facility. You see, dear viewers, I happen to know for a fact that there's a lot of very biased, very bad rhetoric that goes around about African history, and a lot of ignoring which tragically happens. And when it comes to African or even African American history, whole key facets to the makeup of our American heritage, nay, our heritage as the human species, simply disregarded, or even worse, casually mischaracterized for cheap political benefit, or even worse, racist bullshit reasons. In today's episode, I would like to dip my evil, skeleton-loving fingers into a very serious topic: the history of African chattel slavery. My purpose for making this Black History Month series, for the record, is less about me imparting a lot of my own knowledge to you. God knows, I am far from an expert when it comes to African history or African American history. No, rather, I'd like this series to serve as sort of a priming device. I would like to serve as a pointing finger to some really excellent YouTube creators of color who cover specifically the topic of African history and African worldview, etc., etc. And I'd like to do that by sort of jabbing the ribs of the misconceptions. And I'd like to start with slavery. Now, specifically, I mean African chattel slavery. Slavery has been practiced just about all over the place for just about as long as humans have been agricultural and centralized and stable enough to force other people to work for them. But African chattel slavery is different to most historical instances of slavery. Even other instances of chattel slavery, like what you saw in some of the ancient empires like Rome or Persia, etc., etc. You see, African chattel slavery still affects you to this very day. It affects a lot of people. In fact, the effects of this vile institution were felt around the globe. For a scope of time, many fail to fully or accurately consider. But first, let's start at the beginning. What's the root, the origin of African chattel slavery. Now, many of a particular political persuasion or a particular historical bias might argue that, well, Africans were practicing slavery well before the Europeans came along. And this is true. However, slavery as it was practiced in Africa was very much a different beast to the African chattel slavery we saw in, say, the Western Hemisphere, North America, the Caribbean, Brazil, etc., etc. You see, in Africa, slavery wasn't a intergenerational affair. For the most part, you went to war as a faction. You took slaves. Those slaves became a part of your community, and their children were free. Slaves weren't bred or worked to death or cloistered from the rest of the society that they lived in. They were a part of it. The point being that the character of the slavery that was practiced was different to chattel slavery. Another misconception about slavery is that Europeans showed up in Africa, nabbed a bunch of people, and took them away. Now, that's just not the case. Africa, during most of the time wherein slaves were exported from Africa, was too strong in its individual factions and kingdoms for Europeans to do such a thing. There's a misconception, this sort of dark continent image people have of Africa that just simply isn't true. There were some factions in Africa that really gave Europeans a run for their money before their later decline, very much tied into the damage that institutions such as the slave trade did to their different communities. What you had instead were factions throughout different points of history that benefited massively from slavery. Though, to understand some of these factions, you've got to go back a little before the Atlantic slave trade and look instead at the Arab slave trade, because that slave trade is way older. When most people think of slavery, they think of the 10 million plus people that got brought over by the Spanish, the Portuguese, and the British, and the French, and the Dutch. You get the point. To work over here in the Western Hemisphere. When you look at that, you need to remember that's more of a 1600s type of situation, right? Whereas the Arab slave trade, you could trace that all the way back to the 600s. You see, African slave soldiers were very much a part of conflicts in Arabia and India. In India, as early as 400, there is evidence of Africans being imported both as laborers and as wives, but also as soldiers. And this practice of hiring sub-Saharan mercenaries or purchasing sub-Saharan slaves continued through the expansion of the First Islamic Caliphate and straight through to the decline of the Ottoman Empire. And that's where you see many of the factions that really profited from slavery rising up. Factions like Mali, which profited heavily from slavery, among other exports such as salt and huge boatloads of gold, as well as the long-lived Kanem-Bornu Empire of Central Africa. For excellent YouTube videos on these particular topics, I would suggest Hometeam History's videos on Mali and Kanem Bornu, as well as the excellent video on Kanem Bornu by Ronu Spirit, who goes into a just incredible amount of detail on the history of the empire. The selling of humans by the thousands was highly profitable for factions like Kanem Bornu or Mali, but over time served as a major drain on the African manpower and the African network in general. The African populace, I should say, in general. Tens of millions of people over a small handful of centuries sapped away from the continent, left it vulnerable to invasion and exploitation in a way that's hard to fully encapsulate, to fully envision. It's just think of it this way. We have this great resignation happening in the United States, where millions of people leave their jobs. Big economic hubbub. But imagine that, only they're not coming back to work. And their wives aren't going to be keeping up their house or having kids, because they're gone too. Also, the number you're thinking of is significantly larger and a significantly higher percentage of your endemic population. That's how you should think of the impact of slavery on Africa. It left a lot of different peoples and factions absolutely devastated in its wake, over centuries and centuries of just being nabbed, of being sold, and never returning to the continent. African slavery was also quite the institution in India, with unfortunate Africans, usually from the inland of Africa, being exported from the west coast or the Horn of Africa. This institution would grow into a Indian Ocean slave trade, wherein plantations set up in Southeast Asia and South Asia would be manned via African slave power, very similar to what you see in the Caribbean and southern United States. The point of me going over this is to illustrate that slavery, particularly this chattel slavery, is very old, lasted longer than most people give it credit for, and had an absolutely huge scope. I mean, ocean to ocean, really. And the institution is absolutely worse than you could imagine. When people think of slavery, they think of typically either the worst of what you see in the United States within our very limited memory as an average American rememberer, or like some archaic, ancient, distant practice of slavery. But that's just not the character of it that we saw in the European colony sphere of things. It took decades to centuries for Europeans to switch their mode of taking slaves from work them till they're dead over to, oh, we don't have to kill them, we could keep working them and treat them better and then breed them. You know, that was a thing. You know, people were worked to death in South Carolina. People were worked to death even more in Brazil, where they processed sugar. Just an absolutely intensive industry, like a narrow window of harvest where you have to bust your ass to get all that sugar cane. And then they have a sweltering mill where they process the stuff at high temperatures. And people would work for like 48 hours in these mills in Brazil. Just insanity. And abject cruelty. And it's worth noting that they did a bunch of this to natives first. But, you know, a huge amount of natives died of sickness. And a lot of the rest died of fight. And all of this was to save on cost, right? It's hard to convince somebody to move out of Europe and work on a sugar plantation. People knew what that meant, right? Tragically, a lot of the Africans who were taken didn't know what it meant when they were taken. You need to remember the institution they would have been familiar with was not chattel slavery. It was a different sort of slavery. They didn't expect to be worked to death. Some of them really thought that they were food. Like that was a thing. There were people who believed, you know, because Europeans showed up, bought people, left, came back and bought more people in large numbers, that they were on the menu. You know, it's not that ridiculous. You know, and maybe that one is apocryphal. You know, I've always thought that one was a little eh. But I've heard actual historians say it, so maybe it's true. And you know, the point of widening the scope here isn't to be like, oh, the Arabs and the Ottomans. Oh, what terrible people. Oh, the Amazigh dynasties that traded slaves over the Sahara. Oh, they did it for so long. They're so much worse than the Europeans. No, they're not worse than the Europeans. You know, they're equally as racist. You know, they started up, you know, hard labor plantations in Mesopotamia, just the way we started up plantations over in the Caribbean and southern United States, or over in Southeast Asia, or in India. The beast is the same. The racism is the same. The racism is the same. Many of the people who dealt in slaves and practiced slavery in the Arab world looked upon darker skin color the same way many people in the 1850s, 1860s United States looked on it. As lesser. You know, it's a big institution. And, you know, to touch back on a point that I sort of started with, the thing that chafes me the most is people will be like, slavery started in Africa. That's true. You know, the slavery, the chattel slavery that we saw in the United States, you know, the purchase happened in Africa. An African faction sold the people. But they wouldn't have done that if there wasn't somebody paying a high price per head to enslave these people. The institution that we saw before Europeans and Arabs and Indians were buying slaves was different to the institution we saw after. And we're still suffering from that institution's effects. I mentioned before that African chattel slavery still affects you. Now, there's a chance you live in some far-flung corner of the globe that hasn't really been touched by this in a direct way, but more likely you're from the United States, or from Europe, or from the Middle East, or from Asia. And the reality of things is, if you live in anywhere in South Asia or Southeast Asia, anywhere in the Middle East, and anywhere at all in the Western Hemisphere, you live in a country whose economy was initially propped up and built up using chattel slavery. And let's not forget to mention continental Africa, which is, of course, sort of the polar opposite of an economy that has been propped up in the past by slavery, which is nonetheless a region drastically impacted by the institution and memory of African chattel slavery. Yeah, only a real fool would forget to mention Africa while listing off a list of regions affected by African chattel slavery. Knowing Better recently did a really great video, which made me think that maybe I might have something to say for Black History Month this year. He did a video on company towns. An excellent video going over a history of company towns in America, starting way back with
Jamestown
and going straight through to clear through to tech giants and the situation we have now with them building very much live-in towns and facilities for their workers, employees. And in the video, he discussed how
Jamestown
originally brought in indentured servants from Germany and Ireland, debtor types who had nothing better to do with their lives, who were at the end of their rope. Nothing else to do other than cross the ocean to this far-flung tobacco plantation colony, which is what
Jamestown
was. It was a tobacco plantation. It existed for commercial profit for people who never set foot on the colony. And then, one day, it became less expensive to import people from Africa. And on the back of that inexpensive African labor,
Jamestown
built its foundation. People in the United States forget that. They forget the important element that African Americans are to our history, the important part of our history that they are. Without the Africans we brought over, there would be no America as we see it today. Probably be no America at all. And when I see people minimizing and underplaying African history and African American history, it really sets me off. For today's content creator recommendations, I would like to point to Ronu Spirit, I hope I'm saying it right, a Nigerian history, Central African history expert who has some really great detailed vids on, for example, Kanem, Bornu. But he's also done some really great videos on other Central African factions and Mali and Songhai that I have recently watched for research for this series. As usual, guys, thanks for coming out. Sorry if this one got a little long-winded, but it didn't feel like the genuine thing to do to have a strict script with lots of jokes and running gags, etc., or to put on a goofy mask and get up. I really feel that this topic and other Black history topics are very important in understanding the character of American politics and American history. And so I feel like it's important that people like me, people of all backgrounds, take a minute and make their voice heard. There's no excuse in the modern day and age for ignorance. If a blubberous buffoon like me can wrap his head around the scope and impact and causation of slavery, then you probably can too. So this is an admonition. Take some time, go out and find some interesting African history and learn about it. It'll be fun, I promise. If you liked the video, leave a like, subscribe. If you hated the video, leave a like and subscribe. If you are indifferent, leave a like and subscribe. If you didn't see the video at all, but just accidentally clicked through it, come back here and leave a like and subscribe. And as always, y'all stay safe.